Trump wants to take Greenland. It sounds like a strange joke from the news, but let's break down why this topic appeared at all and why, in reality, everything is far more logical than it seems at first glance. If you remove emotions, memes, and shouts of "he's gone crazy," what remains is cold calculation and a clear strategy. For the United States, Greenland is not an exotic island or an icy wasteland. It is an instrument of influence and an asset for decades ahead. Washington has long viewed it as a point that can strengthen American positions in the Arctic. And today, this interest has simply stopped being behind the scenes. The United States is no longer hiding its intentions and is acting openly, because time and its calculations works against those who hesitate. Even the timing is not accidental. By the 4th of July, when America will celebrate its 250th anniversary, the White House wants to show that the country is still capable of imposing its agenda on the world. And already in November 2026 come the midterm elections. At such a moment, any major foreign policy move turns into a domestic trump card. It is easy to sell to voters as proof of strength and strategic foresight. At the same time, this is not about direct pressure in the style of the past century. No tanks on the ice and no military parades. The American model works differently. Economic leverage, political influence, work with local elites, investments, talks about security and development. It is a long process where no one shouts, but the result turns out to be exactly what is needed. Sources say directly, the idea of Greenland did not arise suddenly. It has long been calculated and broken down into stages. Why does this island attract so much interest at all? Everything comes down to geography. Greenland is a huge Arctic platform. Control over it means control over the North Atlantic, key air corridors between America and Eurasia, and a significant part of the Arctic space. This is not a hypothesis. History has already shown it. During the Second World War, events unfolded rapidly. When Germany took control of Denmark within hours, Washington immediately understood that the next step could be bases in Greenland. To prevent this, the Americans themselves moved onto the island and entrenched there before anyone else. After the war, the island formally remained with Denmark, but American influence did not disappear. As early as 1946, the United States offered Copenhagen to buy Greenland for a sum that looked enormous at the time, the equivalent of about $1.5 billion today. Denmark refused, but agreed to the preservation of American bases. In essence, it was a compromise. Legally, the island is Danish. Strategically, it is American. With the beginning of the Cold War, Greenland's importance only increased. The shortest route for a possible missile exchange between the USSR and the United States passed through it. Radar systems on the island made it possible to detect launches in advance, and in the early 1950s, the Thule base appeared there, which over time turned into a key element of the American missile defense and space surveillance system. In the context of growing tension with Russia and China, this point once again comes to the forefront. But military logic is only part of the picture. Trump thinks like a man accustomed to counting assets. And this is where economics begins. According to geologists' estimates, Greenland may contain colossal reserves of rare earth metals, elements without which the modern world does not function. Electronics, satellites, high-precision systems, green energy, all of this is directly tied to such resources. At present, a significant part of this market is controlled by China, and for the United States, this is a real vulnerability. Greenland offers a chance to reduce this dependence. There is also another important factor: the melting of the Arctic. The ice is retreating, navigation seasons are becoming longer, and new sea routes are emerging. Russia is actively using the Northern Sea Route, transporting cargo even under conditions of severe pressure. In the United States, this is seen and understood. They do not have a comparable domestic route. Control over Greenland opens access to these logistical flows and strengthens positions in the struggle for future maritime corridors. The third reason is the Arctic shelf. Scientists believe that up to a quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves may be located beyond the polar circle. Formally, extraction is possible only within a certain zone from the coastline, so every island with access to the Arctic Ocean automatically becomes a strategic asset. Greenland sharply expands the United States' capabilities in this future struggle for resources. A separate line is China. Beijing has long been looking for a path into the Arctic and viewed Greenland as a convenient entry point. In 2018, Chinese companies offered to finance and build a network of airports on the island practically free of charge for local authorities. For Washington, this became an alarming signal. Through pressure on Denmark, the project was shut down, and construction was ultimately taken over by the Americans together with the Danes. Allowing China to gain an economic foothold in Greenland is something the United States is not prepared to accept. For them, this is a hard red line. He does not imply or signal between the lines. He has spoken directly. If the Greenland issue runs into resistance, everything will be used. From tariffs on Danish goods to harsh economic pressure. The formula is simple. Either we reach an amicable agreement, or it becomes painful. And yes, he has also publicly refused to rule out a force-based scenario. It is clear that this is more an element of bargaining and psychological pressure, but the fact itself matters. Such words are not thrown around casually. In Copenhagen, this was heard, and taken with maximum seriousness. Denmark sharply increased its defense budget, and in 2025 alone allocated more than $2 billion specifically for the defense of Greenland. For comparison, not long ago, the country spent roughly that amount on its entire defense budget altogether. So the fear there is not theoretical. Money is not allocated because of tweets. But the most interesting question is what the Greenlanders themselves think. The official position sounds firm and appealing. We are not for sale. Prime Minister Moot Borup Egede has stated directly that the island is not a commodity and cannot be the subject of a transaction. This phrase works perfectly in headlines and looks excellent for a domestic audience. But then, the nuance begins. At the same time, the topic of independence from Denmark is being discussed more and more loudly. And here, the logic changes sharply. Because if Greenland leaves the kingdom, the United States gains the ability to work directly, without complicated negotiations with Copenhagen, without compensation, without legal constraints. Formally, this is no longer taking territory from an ally, but supporting the choice of a new state. And it is precisely in this window of opportunity that Washington sees its main chance. Sociology adds fuel to the fire as well. Polls show that more than half of the island's residents allow for closer ties with the United States, economically, politically, and even in the security sphere. This does not necessarily mean a flag change or full annexation. For many, it looks like a chance for investment, infrastructure, jobs, and a higher standard of living. Denmark is a distant center for Greenland, while America represents concrete money and guarantees. But there is a point that is spoken about more quietly. If Trump does succeed in forcing the issue and bringing Greenland under U.S. control, in any form, it will create an extremely dangerous precedent in international law. Because this is not about a confrontation with some hypothetical adversary, but about the territory of a NATO member state, Denmark. In other words, within the bloc itself, one country is reshaping the map of another. And that is no longer just politics. It is a blow to the foundation of the entire structure. For years, NATO has insisted that threats come from completely different directions, that the alliance is about collective security and the inviolability of borders. And here, a strange picture emerges. The leading country of the alliance is effectively revising the territorial arrangement of an ally. This automatically strikes at NATO's reputation as a unified and predictable bloc. It is hardly surprising that the reaction in Europe was nervous. Germany, Sweden, and Norway have already deployed parts of their forces to reinforce the island's defense. It looks almost surreal. NATO allies preparing to defend the territory of one member of the alliance from another member of the alliance. In France, the situation went so far that Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency meeting of the Security Council. Formally,
Greenland?
because of Arctic stability. In reality, because of the risk of a split within the bloc. And here the most awkward question arises. Who, in fact, is capable of telling Trump no? In theory, everyone. In practice, almost no one. Inside NATO, it is perfectly understood that an open confrontation with the United States means problems with security, funding, and political weight. That is why even the most indignant statements usually end with cautious wording and attempts to find a compromise. As a result, a paradoxical situation emerges. On the one hand, everyone talks about principles, international law, and the inviolability of borders. On the other, everyone understands that if Trump goes all the way, resistance will be weak and limited, because the alliance rests not only on treaties, but also on fear of breaking them, especially when the initiative comes from the main player. In this sense, the Greenland story becomes a test not only for Denmark, but for all of NATO. It is a test of where words end and the real limits of what is permissible begin. And so far, this test looks extremely uncomfortable for everyone except the one who launched it. If you look at the situation without emotions and memes, US actions appear absolutely rational, even boringly rational. America is doing exactly what it has always done, protecting its long-term interests. It's just that now those interests lie not in deserts and not in jungles, but in ice. And the Arctic is gradually becoming the main playing field for the coming century. The world is slowly but steadily entering an era where the key question sounds like this. Whoever controls resources dictates the rules. Not through slogans, but through economics, technology, and logistics. And the Arctic is a vast warehouse that was locked in ice for decades and is now beginning to open. According to various estimates, enormous reserves of oil, gas, rare metals, fresh water, and biological resources are concentrated there. This is not the future. It is a process that has already begun. Russia is in an inherently strong position here, simply because of geography. The enormous length of its Arctic coastline automatically gives it the largest slice of the pie. Add to that developed infrastructure, experience working in extreme conditions, and the Northern Sea Route, which has already turned from theory into a functioning corridor. Norway and Canada are also doing quite well. They have access points, resources, and a clear strategy. But the United States has a problem. Formally, it is also an Arctic power, but its real footprint looks modest. One Alaskan sector, limited opportunities for expansion, and weak influence over key Arctic routes. For a country accustomed to thinking on a planetary scale, this is strategic discomfort. And that discomfort only grows as the Arctic ceases to be no one's land. And this is where Greenland enters the picture. With it, the American position changes radically. It is not just an island, but a geopolitical force multiplier. It expands maritime zones, provides access to new routes, strengthens claims to the continental shelf, and turns the United States from a participant into one of the main players in the Arctic race. Without Greenland, a modest role. With Greenland, the ability to claim far more. Washington understands perfectly well that global leadership is not a permanent constant. It is not a status granted forever. It has to be continuously sustained with resources, technology, and control over key points. And in the long term, America sees a risk. If it misses the Arctic now, catching up in a few decades will already be too late. In this sense, Trump is not an exception, but a concentrated expression of this logic. He is neither a philosopher nor a romantic. He thinks like a person accustomed to calculating assets and losses. And he sees that the next 100 years will pass under the sign of competition for resources, not for abstract values. Whoever enters the Arctic seriously first will set the terms. That is where the haste comes from. That is where the rigidity comes from. That is where the willingness to enter into conflicts even within allied structures comes from. For the United States, the Greenland issue is not a diplomatic gesture and not a personal whim. It is an attempt to lock in positions for decades ahead, while the window of opportunity is still open. At the same time, it is important to understand, America is not acting in a vacuum. It sees Russia growing stronger, China gradually moving into northern latitudes, and Europe itself not fully understanding what to do with the Arctic. In this situation, delay for the United States is equivalent to a strategic defeat. And losing on a century-long horizon is not an option they are prepared to accept. That is why the entire Greenland story looks not like an excess, but like a symptom of the world entering a new phase, a phase of resource competition. And in this, fine words fade into the background. In the foreground are geography, access to raw materials, and control over routes.